Welcome back to the Bonsai Builders podcast. I'm your host, Addison Galambos. We've spent a lot of time talking about the established traditions of Japan and the emerging culture in the US, but today we're heading to a continent that is truly a new frontier for the art form. My guest is Hugh Grant, the founder of Tree Makers in Australia. Hugh has a fascinating background. He studied fine arts before heading to Oregon to intern under Ryan Neal at Bonsai Marae. Now he's back in Australia doing the hard work of deciphering how to turn their unique native species into world-class bonsai. We're going to talk about his journey, the wild west of Australian Yamadori, and also touch on how photographing bonsai influences design. Thanks for joining me, Hugh.
Awesome. Thanks, Addison, for having me on. I really appreciate it.
So something that stuck out to me when I was looking into your background was you hear a lot about people who study agriculture or, some horticultural related degree in school or work at a nursery and then come into bonsai. So they've got that kind of like foundational skill in horticulture. But I thought that your degree in schooling in fine arts was a really interesting perspective to have. And I'm very curious on how what you take away from that degree and put towards bonsai. So I was wondering if you could just take me through your bonsai journey at a high level, from 11 to now, I guess. And then maybe we can dive a little deeper into how art and theory has influenced your bonsai career.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, so, I always find it funny putting this is when bonsai began for me, but it is, there's always a line in the sand, right? But it was probably a slow take up in that I saw a segment on television. There's a bit of a cult classic TV show here called Gardening Australia. It's like a, sort of a watch at dinner time kind of TV show where there's different segments around the country and there's a host for each state and they talk about what's going on, what's happening in the garden or visiting someone's garden or talking about technique. Anyway, they visited a bonsai garden and it was mainly, the guy was working with a lot of ficus and a lot of Australian trees. And I remember in the segment, he showed this beautiful native ficus called the Port Jackson ficus that we have here. And it was over a stone and it was really captivating. And then he showed I can't even remember what it was. It was like a callistemon or a melaleuca of some kind. And he kind of snapped, he was like, when you work on these trees, you break the branches off, you don't cut them. And I just found it really cool. I was like, that's cool. This is really enamoring. And I asked my mother if she could, because I was 11. I was like, Mom, I want a bonsai. Where can I get one? She goes, you know what? There was a sort of a springtime festival fair that would happen just locally to us. And there would be vendors from all over the country selling gazebos to decking companies to nurseries to everything, anything in the garden. And she remembered there was a guy there who was selling trees, so we went along and it turned out it was Ray Nesky Bonsai Nursery, which is a very famous bonsai nursery in Sydney. And anyway, I bought a little maple, he calls them starters, in these tiny little black plastic pots. So you buy it's effectively a 1-year-old seedling. Bought a little pot, potted it into the pot. And my first big lesson was learnt about bonsai. I didn't water it, at all. just didn't do it. It was spring, so it had just come out into leaf. So it probably lasted, I think, a couple of weeks before I noticed that it was dead. And it was dead. And then I remember my little brother, he was a toddler at the time. And just to sort of really rub in that I'd killed this thing, he picked it up, running around. He was just learning to walk and he picked it up and he threw it into the pool. And it sunk to the bottom of the pool. The pot smashed. So my first bonsai, I didn't even get the pot out of it. It was quite destructive. But immediately after that, I was like, all right, I've got to try again. And very soon after that, it just happened to be that a bonsai nursery opened at the end of our road, which is pretty random because there's only a couple of nurseries in the country. And so they started doing free classes, basically as a means to, come in, buy some stuff and we'll help you out with your trees. And so that nursery was called, at the time, Moonpa Nursery. Now has transitioned to fully a bonsai nursery. It used to be just landscape with bonsai on the side, but now they're fully bonsai, called Bonsai World. They're kind of the wholesale distributor for everything bonsai in Australia. And so I started going to classes there, picked up tons of trees over, a 2-year period, going to classes there every month. And
what age was that?
Yeah, I was probably getting closer to 12 by the time I started. So that was probably age of 12, 13.
No
sort of
way. Cool.
when I finished primary school and was entering high school, which for us here in Australia, we only have primary and secondary
Okay.
or
Yeah, I
high
was like
school, we call it. Yeah.
12-year-old at high school. That's pretty impressive.
Yeah. So here, primary school, we had two tiers. There's primary, which is 1 to 6, and then high school, which is 7 to 12. So usually you go to a different school, or they're separate if they're in one school, separate sort of campuses in one school. Yeah. So, and then they kind of like sort of dwindled down their retail business and they shifted back to just working from their wholesale business, which was about 45 minutes away further in the countryside. And so I went to a few of those and then they kind of took a break from the business for a while. So that kind of dissipated. And at that time, I live in sort of like a rural valley and I would go out collecting. So very early on, I got very, very into collecting. I was literally like 14 and I'd be, going out into paddocks and collecting a tree called privet or ligustrum ovalifolium. You might be familiar with them. Some of the most
That one
indestructible.
I've heard of. Some of those other Latin names I haven't, but
Yeah,
privet, I
that's the
know about.
botanical name of the most common
Yeah,
weedy
yeah.
one we have here, ligustrum ovalifolium. And it's an indestructible plant. You can tear it out of the ground and throw it in a pot and it will boom into life. So it was a great tree to sort of, one, get access to large, older material at, when I had, I'd earn 50 cents a week in pocket money, so the only trees I bought from nurseries prior to that were, the goodwill of my parents or my grandparents taking me to workshops, so yeah. So
One question I have on that actually, like in the US, you have to look out for, depending on where you're collecting, like you might have to look out for rattlesnakes, but there's not really a lot else that's too dangerous. But I've heard stories of Australia and I don't know how exaggerated they are. Like how sketchy was it to be 14, 15 out in these kind of collecting areas? Or I guess if it's paddocks, like maybe it's more
yeah.
tame land,
Literally,
right?
this would be. So I lived in a valley. It was kind of like a subtropically type valley, So very lush, very green. It reminds me of what you see from like the southeast, like the Carolinas, kind of, South or North Carolina, kind of looking, ecosystem. If that meant very green, very lush. Very humid in the summers and just sort of cool but pleasant in the winters. So yeah, beautiful little area, 10 minutes from the beach. So we're a valley behind a sort of a hill that basically enclosed the valley behind the coastline. But I guess the perspective is when you live here, you don't think about the dangerous things because it's just your life, right? But also, there definitely are, where on our property, I remember my dad, wielding a shovel and chopping snakes in half that he'd find in the veggie patch, that if they did bite you, they could kill you. Mainly being the red belly black snake or the eastern brown snake, would get plenty of those, and they will kill you if you don't get to a hospital quick enough, for sure. So, but that was just normal life, it's quite
Okay, yeah, you
normal
just
to
grow
have
up
them.
tougher, I guess.
Well, you just grow up knowing that if you see a snake, don't let it bite you. But yeah. So I guess like I spent my childhood sort of crawling through the bush and being a bit of a wild child. And, we had this weed on our property called lantana and it surrounded the other properties too. And it basically, I don't know where it's from, but it forms this like thicket of very aromatic foliage and it builds on itself almost like a vine, like a bougainvillea almost that collapses on itself. And it just sort of submerses the landscape. And all the debris underneath dies and it sort of grows on itself. So you end up with this like dead, almost like a nest of dead material with leaves on top. And we worked out as kids, if you get a thick enough stick, you can kind of whack the dead material and you can tunnel through it and create these tunnels into all of this dead
So
material.
cool.
Oh, so it was just like a fairy tale. Like,
That's a kid's, dream.
and it was
I grew
acres.
up near a forest and we
Yeah.
had we would do that with like blackberry bushes
Yeah,
and like
very
vines would
similar
grow
growth
around
habit
it.
to
Yeah.
blackberry. Yeah, very similar growth habit, except it's not spiky. Um, so which was great. So it would make all these tunnels and make all these little rooms in it. And some of the privets I collected were in these thickets of lantana.
Oh, so cool.
So I'd already built all these tunnels before I was 10, like running around the bush, building all these tunnels in there. And then when I got into bonsai, I was like, ooh, look at that. That privet has a base that looks like a trident maple and a beautiful tapered trunk. I'll cut that back, let it sprout, and then haul it out of the ground with, a little pick or some sticks that I'd built to make shovels out of. And yeah, and I'd collect trees that way. Yeah.
Where were you consuming bonsai media from? Like, were you looking at trees at Japan when you were at these classes? What was the gold standard? Like you talked about trident maple. Like, is that a common species that you were learning about in your classes that was grown there? Or were you guys looking at Japanese magazines? Or
Yeah.
like, where did that come from?
It's a really good question, actually, because I can't quite recall. I think a lot of it was, oh, I know what it was. A lot of it was I would go, we didn't really have reliable internet at our house where we lived. It seems like the backwoods, and it wasn't. But in particular, the valley that we lived in, it was one of the last areas to get like access to like dial-up internet. And then it was the last to get access to Wi-Fi, which wasn't dial-up because the dial-up never worked. It would take 5 hours to load one Google image, So until I was about 15 or 16, we didn't have internet full stop, which was fairly late for even like, I know internet was a little bit later. I've heard through Eve, my wife, that internet seems to have progressed a little bit later here in Australia than it did in America. But even here, like where I lived, it was a little bit later again. So I wasn't really consuming much online. And I remember doing that, going on Google search and like loading up a picture of a black pine for like 4 hours, and it would slowly, whoa, look at that. That's cool. But that wasn't my resource. The main resource was I was part of a bonsai club, which I joined soon after doing those workshops at that nursery. So I'd borrow books from the library there, but I would also borrow books from the local city library. And I would also, when I would wait for the bus from school, there was a bookstore called Dimmock's, really well-known bookstore in Australia. And I would basically go there and flip through the pages of different bonsai books that were there and get inspired and, save up money to buy one eventually. So a lot of it was via that. And then probably primarily seeing at these workshops and at the bonsai club, I was going to, just seeing other people's trees, was my reference for a long time.
I imagine you were one of the only people your age doing bonsai, right? Like there weren't a lot of other
Yeah, at that time,
12-year-olds.
sure.
Yeah.
I think the next youngest person was probably, in their 40s for sure, at the very least.
What do you think grabbed you? Like, do you think that you had some unique experience that you saw these trees, or was it something about you that really gravitated to it? Like, why you, the 11-year-old versus any other 11-year-old
For sure.
growing up in your area?
Well, that is the funny thing, because I actually detested being in the garden. Like obviously I love going out into the bush and like whacking lantana and exploring, right? So I enjoyed that side of trees and the landscape. But, my mum and dad were pretty keen on me going out and helping them do tasks in the garden, like mulching or picking up sticks or pruning
Not
stuff,
as fun.
or just hanging out while they mowed the lawn, like just being around us. And we were always like, oh, no, we just want to watch TV or whatever. But I did have, and this is a sort of in the last couple of years, I've realized this connection to like, why was I enamored by bonsai? And I think it was taking control of the aesthetics. It was always aesthetic first for me.
Mm.
And the reason was we had some beautiful old elm trees at the front of the property, and quite large, they were planted there from the previous owners. And my dad in particular had this kind of like, things have got to be just so, in terms of the trees. So, and I recognize this without knowing what it was, but big deciduous trees, eventually in the summer, the leaves sort of drag down the branches and they almost hit the ground, and then they lose their leaves in the winter and they come up, and then the next year. And you eventually, with deciduous trees, get this beautiful billowy sort of sweeping down to the ground and up and down form, sort of like an oak. Oaks do that quite classically.
Yep. Yeah.
Or in Australia, ficus do it quite classically as well. But my dad would chop those branches off, and some of them were big, big enough at that young age for me to walk on and climb on and go all the way out up the tree and then down the branch and almost back to the ground. So they were enjoyable to hang out on and fun and explorative. And my dad would cut them off, and I would always get upset with him. I remember like being like confused and upset and just, almost angry at him, because I'll be like, no, don't do it. Sometimes like tell him, stop, because I love those branches. And so
those are the best ones.
Yeah. And so I feel like, and I remember in a sense, without like putting words to it at that time, when I think back on the feeling, is I thought they were fun and I thought they were enjoyable. But I also think I thought they were beautiful. I had some connection to them. And in a way, I feel like bonsai was a way for me to like take back control of the tree aesthetics that I seemingly didn't have control of from from my childhood, if you know what I mean. I mean, at the time it was in my childhood, but that's what I think my connection was. I think that's why I resonated with it, because I was like, oh, this is where I can have my say over what branches get pruned or not.
Interesting. So there was the aspect of you had this really deep connection with these trees that you know were a part of your life, right? Like playing in them and running through them. But then there was also the aspect of like the you wanted to own the aesthetic of the plant, right? And it was kind of like, oh, this is a big tree that my dad prunes, and this is a small tree that I prune. You know, or
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
I get to you do the direction of, right? So it's
yeah,
almost like size to you.
yeah,
Interesting.
absolutely. Yeah, yeah. It was something that I could have a say over, and have autonomy with.
Yeah. Very cool. So yeah, sorry to interrupt you. I just wanted to kind of jump in
No,
there.
no.
So I mean, you had this deep love of trees as you know, through high school, and started getting into bonsai, but did you ever consider doing it as a career or from a monetary perspective? Like, how did you then transition to going to college, and like
Yeah.
what part did bonsai play in your mind as you aged?
Yeah, I think I definitely carried that cliche notion as a teenager of like, yeah, I want to do this as a job, and I want to be, those I don't know if in America it's the same, but in Australia, those who studied in Japan, it was almost talked about like this unachievable, romantic, horrific, thing. And almost like that's the only way to do it as a job from let's say the artist's perspective, to just become someone who grows seedlings and raises them in pots to sell in a bonsai context. Cool, very achievable. But to be kind of like that master of bonsai, it seemed like a path I wanted to take, and it seemed so romantic. It was impossible, but also I think always I've existed in a world or a mentality where, I'll kind of just, when it comes to a job or a career path, I've never ever been super like taken it very seriously in a sense. And so that's allowed me to kind of like always be like, oh, well, it's possible if you want to do it. You just got to do the thing, and do the thing and follow your heart's content, in doing that and whatever that looks like. So I guess as a teenager, I did want to take that path. Didn't really push in a route to find that path in any serious sense, but it was something I wanted to do for sure. Like it was in the back of my head is like, yeah, I'd love to do this as a job full time, And I would pontificate like what would my nursery look like? What would my practice look like? Where would I go? What would I do? Yeah, in a very
What
non-serious sense, but in a sense that I would just do it.
Yeah, you were actually thinking about it though. Were there the club that I was in whenever I was a kid, there was nobody there going to Japan, or like there was zero examples of like somebody doing that path. So like I didn't even know that it was a possibility, right?
Yeah,
So
same here.
okay. I was just wondering, like, because we are kind of the product of our environments, right? And so
Absolutely.
maybe you would have gone a different path if there were examples, right? But
Yeah, 100%. Would have been very different if I was surrounded by, if that was like a direct route to be able to achieve. And, in some parts of Australia, I mean, there's a guy named Tony Bebb, really well known in the scene, great guy. And he travels to Japan a lot and does small amounts of studies with like Koji. And
Hiramatsu, yeah.
yeah, and he, I think it was him. I'm actually not 100% sure on this, but there's a guy named Sean Hartley who is about to finish, first Australian to finish a full, 100%, like you've got to leave now, full apprenticeship in Japan. So
Wow.
I think Tony Bebb did like sort of facilitate that for him. And so, in certain parts of the country lately, there's been sort of those direct doorways that have been opened up for people to start that process of studying over there. But in my inner circles, that just wasn't a thing. Japan was something that people did on holidays, as a little holiday trip, but it wasn't seemingly like an open avenue to
Yeah.
find
Yeah. You
bonsai as
just
a
wouldn't
career
even
path.
know how to do
Yeah.
that. Yeah. So how did you get to school then? So you got a bachelor's degree, I'm assuming, after high school, right?
Yeah. Yeah. So I did that. So in this notion of like, hey, I probably want to do bonsai as a job. Also, I was thinking like, probably not, at the same time, right? It was this very wish-washy thing. So I wanted to go and study landscape architecture or potentially straight architecture. I've always been very interested in buildings and plotting out, as a kid, something I used to also like doing was taking big bits of paper and doing sort of like blueprint drawings of what my dream home would look like. For some reason, with a lot of emphasis on the driveway. Sometimes I would stick bits of paper together because the driveway was just that long.
Do you have a sweet driveway now, or have you lived your dream?
I do. Where we live now, it does have a longest driveway. I have never put that together. That's funny. It does have a longest driveway. That's hilarious. But so I was always interested in buildings, and I've always found buildings very beautiful and I have reactions to buildings, So I had this like sense of like, oh, maybe I'll do architecture or landscape architecture. That sounds really cool. And out of school, in New South Wales, in the state I'm in, you receive an ATAR. So when you finish high school, you get a score out of 100. And different degrees require a certain ATAR score to get into. There's other avenues, after that to get in. And the ATAR score really matters the most when you're immediately out of high school. But out of high school, you feel like it's the end of the world, or like there'll be no other options if you don't do something straight away. You don't realize how big life is at that time. But I didn't have the score. So I applied to get into fine arts because you can do, if you gain certain credits in another degree that is affiliated, you can transfer those over and get into the program you want to get into in the same school. So that was my plan. So I got into a fine arts degree at Newcastle University, got in, went and did that for a year, and kind of just stayed doing that, to be honest. I was enjoying it. It was really unique degree in the way it ran. It was very free and open and flexible and, quite dynamic compared to a lot of the other degrees I saw people in. And there was a guy who was maybe second year in architecture, and he was taking some electives in some of the classes I was doing in art. And he was just a mess, like stressed and just tired. And I was kind of like, do I want to be that guy? Anyway, so I just stayed in the degree I was in and just enjoyed the hell out of it. And, just stuck with it. And yeah, so I sort of put architecture to the side. At least I thought I'll just see this degree through and then just see what happens. Yeah. Yeah. It was kind of the pathway there.
And then I want to go back to the degree and how it connects to bonsai in the future, but let's maybe finish out your okay, you graduate from school and now you want to make this dream of becoming a professional, live. How did you then up level yourself in terms of bonsai skills to where you're at today?
Well, so like during that degree time or before or after?
Well, I don't know. When did you, I'm assuming you weren't as good as you are now at bonsai whenever you were in high school. So I'm curious, like when did that process?
Well,
when did you get more training?
I guess so I was always like through my teenage years, I was always very self-exploratory. I don't want to use like self-taught, like I taught myself everything, but it was more like I was curious, and I was very okay with failing. Like I would push trees. Like I killed privets, which apparently is impossible, but I killed them, and I killed
real pioneer.
Yeah, exactly. Pioneer of privet death. Just lessons like, like where I was studying, and this is no fault of them. It was just, this is just information not being consumed in the nuanced way that it needs to be. Privets grow roots quickly. They need to be repotted very often. So, I'd see roots growing and I'd go, I knew one guy, he would repot his privet every 3 months, and that was the advice. So I took my privet that was starting to become refined and be, it was the first tree I was ever proud of. I'd take it out of the pot and I'd root prune it, put it back in the pot. 3 months later on the dot, I'd take it out of the pot. I'd prune off all the roots and I'd put it back in the pot. 3 months later, take it out of the pot, prune off all the roots. And I did that until I killed it. I remember the very last time I root pruned it. I pulled it out of the pot and it just had a few white roots coming off of the last quite big cuts that I'd done, for no reason, but just because that was the task to be done. And I remember pruning these few fine white roots, and I remember going up to the shed, and there was my bag of, just organic potting soil I was using to pot all my trees into. It was the last bit in the bag, and it had been left in the rain, so the soil had started to sort of decompose and become gluggy. And I was just like, privets don't mind, so I just slapped this glug into the pot and put the tree in with no roots, and it just died. And I remember being like, I feel like this isn't correct. It was like the first epiphany where I had that feeling of that knowledge of this technique, but it is so nuanced and depends on so many other things. And it sort of was the first, if I think about it, moment where I realized I've got to be curious myself, not necessarily be told what to do, just out of like, oh, do this. It's a privet, you repot it at this time 4 times a year. But sort of started to become a bit more exploratory in my own practice. And I think after that, I was probably about 15 at that point, I think I became very like self-guided in that I wanted to see why when I do an action does something happen. When I fail, I would take it not as like a loss. I'd be sad, lost some great trees at that age. But, every time I had a death or a broken branch, I'd say, okay, cool. Like I now know how not to do this. This is awesome because I've seen the furthest end of what is possible. Don't go there. Let's go everywhere in the opposite direction to that. And so I think I developed quite a like discerning ability to sort of look at my mistakes and realize what I could otherwise do to reach a better goal. So I was very self-critical and very self-inquiring for a long time there.
How much of that was, the challenge to me of that is like essentially developing bonsai, like a framework via intuition, right? And experience. And I'm curious, like, do you feel like it was very intuitive? Like, would you think things through, or would you just know like, oh, I've done this before, I don't do that again? So I guess my question is, did you develop some kind of mental framework where like you could generalize your knowledge via like, oh, like, I think, for example, like a very good example is like Ryan talks a lot about, like, oh, energy balance and things like that. Like, did you have some sort of like scientific method or like framework that you developed that you actually like had kind of like written out or more formally created, or was it more intuitive? It was like, I built muscle memory for how to handle trees.
Yeah, not necessarily. It's a great moment that you mentioned Ryan, because 2010 he came back from his apprenticeship in Japan, right? And so in 2010 I was 16 years old. So at that time, and for me, all of my high school grades aligned with the years. So in grade 10 was 2010. So it's always really easy to remember like where I was at in life, if I think back on the years in terms of school years. But that timing kind of aligns with where I was starting to have like successes and starting to be more inquisitive about like, okay, there's more to this bonsai practice than, follow a menu. It's more intuitive, as you say, and responsive to the tree's needs and the tree's actions. And horticulture is aligned with technique, is aligned with aesthetics. I started to see this sort of meshing of all the worlds, because at the time I was very technique and aesthetic driven, pre-aesthetic first, technique second. Horticulture I hated, absolutely. Like whenever I got a bonsai book, I would intentionally not look at the fertilizing, pest and disease, watering, soil section. I would literally flick over it. It was like boring. Like I had no time of day for it. When I was first 10 years of bonsai even. It was at that time I don't know, I have no idea how on earth I came across his work or him, but it was sort of when he was leaving Japan, starting at his garden, 2010. I have no idea how. I don't know if it was his first website, because I remember he had a website pretty early on, or if it was Instagram, or like I can't recall at all. But I was following his work from the get-go that he arrived back in America. And again, I can't recall how I was picking up little bits of information, but just the way Ryan speaks about the horticultural ties to technique and aesthetics, right? And I think it was at that time where I needed that. I needed to take that more seriously. I was starting to sort of like pick up some of his really, really quite simple teachings around that topic. And I think it was at that time that I started to sort of like piece that all together a bit more and be a bit more intentional around horticulture and the science of bonsai and start to become interested in it, because I had this sort of like guy who was speaking about it very practically, very like sort of sensibly, you could say, and tying it to the technique.
Yep.
And like I said, that section, I think in my journey is very muddled. I can't remember what came first or where things arrived, or am I taking information I'd heard 5 years after that and realizing I had an intuitive response 5 years earlier, but now I have a sentence to put to that intuitive response. It's hard to sort of like recognize that.
Yeah, yeah, it makes sense.
Yeah. That's something I sort of realized a lot lately. It's like that story around like I realized I had empathy for my dad chopping off branches of the tree. I had no words or even a way to put that story together. It's through recollection much later and realizing intuitively that's what I was feeling or doing, right? But now I have like language to be able to put to that. I feel like that's a lot
Exactly.
at time in my life and associated with bonsai. It's a lot of intuition now. Now I have words for that memory, or why was I making certain decisions or actions or coming to certain
Well,
realizations.
I mean, as you grow older and gain wisdom,
Yeah, that's
or at least understand more, right? You can then look back at these things and go, "Oh,
yeah,
this is the pattern that this fits into, right? This is."
exactly. That is wisdom,
Yeah,
isn't
it makes sense.
it?
Yeah,
Yeah. So
hopefully.
I don't know if that answers your question, but it was like,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
yeah, it was around that time. And like when I was at university, I think like that would have been 2013 to um, 15 and 16. That was around the time, again, Ryan's work was starting to really ramp up and he was really exposing himself. And, at that time on his Instagram, he would just pop up a picture. You could tell he just worked on it that night and he'd just whack up a picture of like a limber pine, like, oh, cool, I just styled this before and after. It was very raw. It was a very raw version of like sort of showcasing his work. I'd check back on the gallery continually because every time he worked a tree, he would upload a photo of it to the Mirai gallery. Yeah, yeah, had it to this point. It had been around a little while at that point.
Yeah, yeah.
But yeah, that was that. He was a super big influence, and I had a lot of gravity around like following his work. Like it was kind of like the first time I became fascinated in bonsai outside of just looking at book and not associated an artist to that work. He was the first time I was actually like a bit of a groupie around an artist, like one particular guy. Like I used to peruse Walter Paul's blog and all that, but I didn't necessarily ever have like this like connection to the work. Where with Ryan's work, instantly I had this connection to it.
Yeah, that makes sense.
And so,
That's cool to have been following him right from the beginning when he came
sure,
back.
yeah,
I just wasn't even I guess yeah, 2011 through 2015, that's when I was in college and I wasn't doing a lot of bonsai then and just it was I didn't get started in like actually following bonsai like that until later. So
yeah,
that's cool. When did you go to Mirai for the first time then, or like
yeah. So
was
it
that
was.
how did that come about?
Yeah, so it was in 2016. And again, this is all working out with all these questions, but it ties into this. So, university, I was following his work, became very enamored by the work. And it was the first moment I was kind of like, if I'm going to study overseas, if I'm going to study bonsai overseas, and at that time I was like, this is what I'm going to do. This is what I want to do out of uni. I'm doing this fine art degree. I feel like this is helping me think about how I want to live as an artist. And yeah, I was like, if I'm going to study overseas, you know what? I really don't want to do it in Japan. Like I had, that was the sense I had. Like I
Hmm.
didn't want to, like, it wasn't like something that attracted me. And I think that was because what I saw in Ryan's work was, it was a connection to local space. He was connecting to his native environment. And at that time, he was only just starting to really explore forms that maybe were very experimental, maybe not quite hitting the mark all the time, I think, in terms of where he hits it now. But I really appreciated the sentiment of like, hey, I want to work with what's around me, my local trees, and take inspiration from that to create the work. Instantly I was like, that's what bonsai is. That's exactly what it is, at least for me. And so instantly I had this like detraction from studying in Japan and it's funny now, I actually really, really full circle, I really appreciate those who study in Japan but at that time I was like, nah, that's not the way. I want to study with someone who has done that. I don't want to piggyback on that. I want to piggyback on the skill set that he in particular had learned. And then he's applied in this context of trying to discover his own voice in his own country with his own materials. And then from a business perspective, also apply that to a Western sort of business sense. Now, Australia runs a bit differently in that sense. We have a different sort of, I guess, economical system and values in that, but it's more similar than not, right? So I instantly saw, I was like, if I study with this guy, I get so many more things out of
Yeah.
this experience. It just
It
seemed to make
goes like
sense.
directly down the path that
For sure.
it seemed more well aligned with
For sure.
what you wanted to have as an outcome. Yeah, it
And I
made
just
total
happened
sense.
to love his work, so I was like, that would be amazing. And so during uni, he came out the first time to Australia and did some workshops at a nursery called Bonsai South, Leon Kwong's nursery. And I signed up to the workshops, went to the workshop, and this would have been 2015. And sorry, I forgot. I had seen him. He came in. No, it was the second time he came. The first time he came was 2013 to the national convention that happens every year, and he partook in being the headliner and at that convention. And that was sort of where, again, I think I got really influenced by his work because I was like, here he is in person doing this cool stuff. I made like a really shitty YouTube video, basically filming his demo. I think you can still find, if you go to Bonsai Evolution.
That's hilarious.
It was like a YouTube channel I created with one video, which is that one video. I had credits and everything. Like I put a lot of emphasis on the opening scene and the credits, and it's funny. Totally abandoned that page straight away after that. But yeah, so I went to the workshop, worked on this juniper with him. I'll brag. He had a lot of compliments about the work I was doing, and the wiring and the, yada, yada. Produced a cool tree. That was amazing. It was the first time I had this like, wow, bonsai is process kind of moment, I think, where we went through these steps and I felt affirmed in how I was practicing, and, he was impressed. At least he said he was. And I walked away from it feeling great. And at the end of it, I had this agenda, but at the very end, I said, Ryan, hey, come around the corner. I took him around the corner, and I was like, so big question. I really want to study with you. Can we make that happen? Could I be I can't remember what I said, whether it was apprentice or I said something along those lines. And he kind of went, you do good work, and yeah, let's talk, send me an email. And that was it. And I was like, cool. All right, no worries. And I also said to him, because 2 days later I was moving to the UK to do a study abroad, 6 months study abroad over there. And it was going to be my 21st birthday. So my family had bought me, because I was going over with very little money. It was going to be very sort of uni student vibes. And they had bought me accommodation, a train ticket, and, enough money to go to the Norlanders Trophy, which it was called at the time. And so I said, I'm going to be there next month. I'll see you there, because he was headlining that event.
Cool.
And he kind of went, oh, yeah, okay, cool, Lee. Anyway, a few days later, moved to England, yada, yada, yada. A month later, got the train down to the trophy, Norlanders Trophy at the time. Went to the event, and I was wandering around the vendors area, and I was at Tom Bender's booth. I think it was the first time Tom Bender actually had a booth of his own, not on Tony Tickle's table. I think. It's hard to recall, but I was looking at his work, and I'd heard about Tom Bender, and I was chatting to him, and I had 120 euros to spend, on things. And I was looking at his smallest, tiniest pot that he had. And this was like the first time he was really selling his work in a major way. And I was like, will I spend all my money on this pot? I did.
Pot,
I ended up doing it. And then I remember Ryan walks over to the table, and I just watch him. He's talking to Tom, and I'm sort of behind the shelves looking. And I remember Ryan sort of like casting a hand over all the tables, being like, yeah, I'll take all this stuff.
So cool.
I think it was the first time Ryan did like a wholesale purchase from Tom. Just did it in person, picking out all these pots. I think that's the true story. That's my feeling of it, at least anyway. But I sort of tap him on the shoulder. I was like, Ryan. And he looks at me, he squints, and he goes, you from Australia? And I was like, yeah. He goes, you did make it. So I think in a way he thought like, oh yeah, cool. Who's this guy just saying he'll be in Europe in a few weeks, And he was like, yeah, oh, look. He said, do you know anyone? I was like, no, I don't know anyone. He's like, oh, just hang out with us. And so I hung out with him and his wife at the time, Chelsea, and he was demoing, and I was hanging out with her, and yeah, we're just like sort of hanging out. Went out to dinner with them. He kind of introduced me to a bunch of people, and then I remember, he was introducing me to someone at dinner the next night, and he's like, oh, this is Hugh. He's going to come study with us, soon, and be our apprentice. And I was like, oh. I guess that, and in my head, I was like, oh, that means he wants me to come, and I spoke to him after. He's like, yeah, yeah, just do reach out. Because I don't think I had actually reached out at that point by then, because I thought, I'll wait to see him in Europe. And so I did, and we came to an arrangement. It would be, I would get back from England mid-year that year, and then I'd have one more year of my degree. So it wasn't until mid-year 2016 that I'd finish. So I said, 2016, mid-year, I'll come. So I arranged to come basically, I think it was like, again, 2 or 3 days after I finished my degree, I had a plane ticket to go to America for the minimum visa stay of 90 days is the maximum visa stay. So 90 days is the maximum. So I think I had like 89 days that I had set aside to be there. Yeah. And so went straight over, missed my graduation, had other priorities. Yeah. And went and did, and did 3 months of study there.
Awesome. How formative would you say like that time was for your practice? I've been thinking a lot about trying to get similar experiences, and just like with working, full time, it's hard to, I can't just go away for 6 months, a year, or like I could, but I'd have to get, change jobs or something. So, but like 3 months, a month seems doable, but I'm curious, like, yeah, how impactful do you feel like those 3 months were? And like, what were you doing for majority of the time?
Well, from an impact point of view, it was revelationary for sure. Is probably the easiest way to put that. It was an interesting time in my life. I know. I feel like Ryan would have a lot of things to say about a pivotal moment in my life. I was straight out of high school, straight into uni. I was very dedicated to university. I loved it, and I was just fully into my practice, and loved that freedom in life. Working super minimally, but working super hard at uni. And then I went straight to Mariah. While I was there, my girlfriend from uni, she broke up with me while I was there, goddamn, which was at the time traumatic, over the phone break up, it was pretty sad. So I know Ryan would have a lot to say about that. I was pretty depressed for a few weeks there. But, it was a time where I was really like, I'd been so like in this world of study for, 12 years of school, and then nearly 4 years of uni, and then I was at this one place alone a lot of the time, working on my own, no girlfriend, and yeah, it was really tough.
Secret to getting good at bonsai. No,
Yeah, it was
started,
tough. Like emotionally, it was tough. It was a real like turning point in my life of like trying to sort of, I think, develop a bit of autonomy. Now, it sounds like I probably did have autonomy, but I didn't feel like I did. So it was agreed, and I'll be very honest about this. It was agreed. Ryan really wanted me to come back and do a full apprenticeship, 3 to 5 years. And I said yes. And I got back from that time, and I kind of just like, I was kind of like exhausted and wanted to be exhausted from a social point of view. So I kind of disappeared for a year or two. Not from the world, but like, I had a few good friends, and we sort of developed our friendship, and I kind of just spent a year or two just like letting loose and partying, and like just being a free spirited, early 20-year-old, which I hadn't really let myself do up until that. I was so like dedicated to like, I want to do this art thing. I want to get better. I want to then go do this bonsai thing and do an apprenticeship. And it was in that moment I learned that I kind of just needed to be a young sort of brat and just brat around. And I did sort of at that time let the apprenticeship offering sort of dissipate. But I don't regret that at all. I gained a lot of, I guess, tools and insight and knowledge through being at Mariah, like process. And I was very, very applied, I think, when I was there. I was very like just swept up in it all. And I remember Ryan just gave me juniper after juniper after juniper to clean the dead wood and paint the dead wood and clean the live veins. And, he would give me like on the side styling projects to do in my own time, sometimes during the day, helping out Troy, picking suckers off of redwoods endlessly. Yeah, it was a really, really formative time. And I think I picked up a lot more like words for the intuitive process of bonsai, like a lot of capacity and
language to be able to actually like describe things that Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah. And it was at that time. So while I was there, Ryan was purchasing and gathering together all of the live stream gear. This was like a concept that was coming together while I was there. And so he sort of launched it about 2 months after I was there. So I immediately was on that and, basically applying his teaching through Mariah Live to what I had done. So although I was having this 2 years of partying, I was Mariah Live tragic. I was there every time in the chat, watching the video. Yeah, I was there, right? and then studying every video that came out, watching them multiple times. So for a few years there was not one part that I had missed. In fact, I'd gone over it, written notes, applied that, I guess, like I felt like I had this ability.
You're still studying. Yeah.
I was still studying. Yeah. And in a way, I think that made me feel like I hadn't missed the opportunity. I feel like this was like the perfect storm to be able to still take that experience. And of course it never would have been, it's totally different. Right. But I felt satisfied with that. And yeah, so it was absolutely groundbreaking for me. And, I sort of reached out to Ryan a few years later and said like, hey, like, sorry, hi, I'm here. And I'm still interested in having like some sort of study arrangement with you. And, he was like, yeah, like, look, you do what you got to do. And when you want to be here, you can be here. And, so I'll always thank him for that. And I try and take that opportunity up when I can and go and study when I can and help out. And, Ryan's really, really, I appreciate the admiration he has for me and the admiration I have back, and that like, I can go there and he, he's like, here's my best tree. He's like, do your thing. I trust you.
Yeah. Cool.
That's a 5-year apprenticeship just in saying that and giving me that capacity for a few days or a week or two to do that. That's
totally.
Yeah.
So learned. That actually brings up a question for me of something I've noticed with like Sam, for example, is, and this is like a place that I want to get to, but I'm not at yet, but you get to a certain skill level where there aren't really that many people that you can learn from. It's like, you get like, let's say you've graduated from the 300 level and now you're on the 400 level of class or, whatever. Right. And so how do you make time, or like, how do you prioritize that like 400 level knowledge? Is it just like, whenever you can get to Mirai and study with Ryan, and like, are you still approaching those kind of learning opportunities with like, oh, here's my punch list of like things that I've run into in my practice that I need to get answers to? Like, obviously you can continue to do that kind of self-study, but how do you think about that? Like the pursuit of that, like 400 level knowledge, or like,
yeah, that's a great question. Yeah. It's a great question. A great friend. I would say I'm going to sort of flip it on you and say like, if we are going to prescribe like a hierarchy to things and we're going to call it 400 level, I feel like 400 level is when you start to almost look at, rather than them being very little people to study from, I think actually looking back and saying, I can learn so much from anything, whether it's looking at a tree and unpacking it, or studying with someone who maybe quote unquote is less experienced than you or has less hierarchy, because hierarchy doesn't necessarily dictate skill. I don't think, you can rise to the top without, it could be socially, right? Versus skillfully, right? I think that's a very true thing that I think is important to say, and not pointing anyone out when I say that, but it's just a thing, there's different ways to be in a hierarchy for sure. But I think like what I try and do is I try and learn from everything, like I try and open my world to be like, a student comes in, I try and learn as much as I can from them while I'm teaching them, and having no ego around that, like a question gets asked and I go, you know what, I've never thought about it that way. I'm glad you've asked that. And here's my thoughts that are coming to mind as I try and answer this for you. But I'll be honest that it's coming to mind right now. And then they'll offer something back and I'll be like, wow, look at this thing we both just like came up with. And that wouldn't happen if you weren't working with someone who was quote unquote better than you, right? That is the process. So I'd say like being at 400 level means being a denser sponge than you ever could be before. Because you do have, I think, that articulation to be able to be that sponge. You have all of this information. I think the worst thing you can do when you are, at the top of the hierarchy, or you are, a teacher in any level of the hierarchy. I think for me, one of my mottos is, if I'm going to be a teacher, I have to be a student. Like that's very important for me. And that's where like you going studying at Mirai is I'm going to be the kindergarten student again, working with, I put myself in that position. And that's why it's so beautiful that Ryan kind of raises me up when I'm there and says, hey, no, we're on a similar level here. Do your best, while you're here. But I still go in being like, I'm grade 1 in bonsai, right? because that's my like rule, like humble myself, be challenged, be ready to be like slapped in the face if I do something wrong, you know. And because of that, I make sure that I excel in myself. But you know, like working with other friends or colleagues, I find that really valuable. And just like continually studying. Like I can't look at a tree and not unpack the shit out of it. You know, like break it down to its bare bone components, pull apart all the materials, lay out all the materials of the house on the ground, you know, is the way I think about it. You know, where's the screw? Where's the stud? Where's the concrete slab? You know, how is this thing all constructed? So yeah, I would say being at, you know, it's very hard for an Australian to sort of talk about themselves. We have this thing called the tall poppy syndrome where, you know, it's a social construct that we have in Australia in which it's in the UK too, but in which when you talk about yourself, it's kind of like seen as a bit of a no kind of thing. But
Sorry for putting you on the spot on a podcast, but
I will lean into that and say, like, I do think I appreciate my skill set in myself, and I do value it. And I think I do good work. Right. And I hope other people see that, but it doesn't mean that I am not a student at all. In fact, that trope of, you know, the more you know, the less you know, like the more you learn, the less
totally
the expanse of what you could learn becomes open to you. And I do feel that the more I learn about bonsai in all its facets, whether it's horticulture, inspiration, the conduit of learning about the ecosystem or the landscape or the science of how a tree functions or a technique, like everything, right? The complexities of aesthetics that are almost unteachable because they're intuitive, you know, the more I do it, the more I realize there's an endless amount I'll have to learn and will never actually reach because it is so individualistic at the end of the day.
Yeah. So two things I want to pull out of that I think are very interesting is one, you know, the podcast is looking at the journey, you know, of a hobbyist to getting to a high level of skill, right? And one thing that I want to pull out from that is I think teaching people from what you said is a good way to continue to develop your own skills too. That's a phase in the cycle, right? It's like you learn something, you do it, you learn from somebody who teaches you, and then you crystallize it and teach someone else. And through that learning process, actually Jonas was on the podcast and he said a similar thing. Like he has learned a lot from actually the teaching process. So maybe that's something that in somebody's bonsai learning journey, like that's an important component that they need to think about is like, how do you give back and then like get so much in return from doing that teaching give back process? And then the other thing is like, it's very clear to me that you reach a certain skill level and you start to have these tools to be able to self-assess, right? Or to be able to I think you said like deconstruct the tree, right? From the bones. And so it seems like once you start to get that vision, you've got to a point where you can be critical of your own work or other people's work in order to improve. And that's probably an important phase in the learning journey too, which you can be a little bit more autonomous when you're in that phase and don't rely as much on direct tutelage, right?
Yeah, for sure. It becomes self-inquiring, which I think is when you really start learning. And you need a teacher behind you to like propel you in that direction. I think always, like I said, you've got to always be a student, whether that means you have someone beside you or no. I think there will always need to be moments that someone's beside you at no matter the level. But yeah, it is very self-propelling that journey. Yeah, to find that. I'm not sure. Could you rephrase how you want me to answer that?
No.
Discussion?
No. That was, I was just making some comments on what you had said. Yeah, exactly. So, okay. So I want to transition a little bit and I want to hear about Australia. So
sure.
Well, first of all, I would love to just know like what are the species you're most excited about there? Like, and what are their characteristics? Like deciduous, conifer.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe we can start with that.
Yeah. So again, these are really recent developments I've had in, I guess, like creating a clear body of language to sort of describe what on earth is Australian bonsai? Because forever, there's always been this notion of like Australian bonsai is different, right? And I have for a long time kind of raged against that and been like, what the hell is different, right? There is a lot of difference. That's absolutely true. Again, smaller than they are larger. Aesthetic differences are different for sure, but Australia is a continent that's dominated by, if we break up the categories of trees into deciduous broadleaf evergreen, and conifer, Australia is dominated by the middle one there, the broadleaf evergreen, which I think is a unique trait in terms of an ecosystem when compared to the Northern Hemisphere. And that is, I think, the one major defining factor of what makes Australian bonsai feel differently. It's literally, we're using not a different paint in the palette, but it's a greater proportion of the paints for sure. And that's, I think, what defines it as different, because obviously you have very different aesthetical sort of contexts that are derived from those three different types of plants and the way they grow. Broadleaf and conifer are very different, right? In a large sense, they are different systems, but the deciduous broadleaf and the broadleaf evergreen have, different actions. I do think about deciduous, evergreen, and conifer in that order. And I see the broadleaf evergreen picking up attributes of coniferous aesthetics or horticulture and deciduous aesthetics and horticulture. And some sway more to other sides than the other, or have equal proportions of both. And that's just a way I like to think about it. But that is really what makes Australian bonsai quite different. And Southern Hemisphere bonsai, or just the ecosystem in general. The Southern Hemisphere is dominated by broadleaf evergreen type plants, and the Northern Hemisphere seemingly seems to be dominated by broadleaf deciduous and conifer plants. That's kind of my feeling and distinction around that.
What would be the canonical like Japanese broadleaf evergreen? Like, is there an analog that you're learning on, and like a lot of these techniques are coming from that you
Well, I tell you
ultimately
what, I
apply
pick
to
up
your
a lot of,
broadleaf, or like
yeah, I feel like I pick up a lot of it's a lot of, I feel like I pull a lot now from deciduous mentality. If I'm looking at a Japanese sort of like reference point, it's like looking at deciduous forms, it's looking at pruning timing, pruning methodologies, energy management. I'm really looking a lot at deciduous sort of forms. But then for some species, like a lot of our smaller, like I categorize them as small leaf broadleaves. So Australia has a lot of broadleaf trees that have leaves that are as tiny as a juniper scale. Like a procumbens juniper scale, absolutely minuscule. They look like conifers, but they're broadleaf trees physiologically. But there are crossovers in terms of oxygen, water management that you would apply to a coniferous sort of realm of bonsai practice, or even foliage pad creation in a coniferous realm with a broadleaf horticulture, so very, very curious crossovers. And that is a very, I think, unique aspect of Australian bonsai, is we have this sort of palette of very tiny leafed broadleaf trees that have vascular systems that are quite primitive, you could say, have a crossover with coniferous vascular systems in a way, majorly in that they segment up very quickly into like linear vascular systems like junipers do. Or they have a very like limited ability to backbud like a lot of conifers do. And so you have this sort of meshing of worlds. And that's how I start to draw concept and aesthetic and technique, is looking at deciduous and conifer worlds and then sort of mashing them together and applying that to the broadleaf evergreen world.
yeah. How do you decide like what's enough, or like what's the peak for a tree that hasn't necessarily been cultivated in Japan for 100 years or hundreds of years? So you don't have the like, this is what peak trident maple looks like or something like that, right? Like I always struggle with that a little bit with native species in the US. It's like, I guess for me, it's like, a Rocky Mountain juniper. It's like, okay, you've got Rocky Mountain juniper number 1. That's like the farthest refined Rocky Mountain juniper that there's pictures of online or something like that, right? But like in Australia, do you feel like there are examples of like that peak refinement for these different species, or like who's trailblazing, or like how do you think of like, how do you know if you've gone far enough whenever you're working with one of these species in terms of what's possible?
Yeah, well, look, that is the question that comes up often, for sure, because a lot of these species that we're playing with are, we're discovering what are I like to think about them as reliable species. Because the other aspect of Australian bonsai is it's a very, very biodiverse part of the world. I mean, there's over 10,000 woody plants in Australia alone. I believe that's correct. I hope I'm correct there, but that's the number I've got in my head. But there's a lot. I mean, like eucalyptus, which you're probably familiar with, there's just under 1,000 species of eucalypt in Australia.
Wow.
So, and a lot of the different genuses in Australia have not all of them that many, but a lot of them are in the hundreds of species per genus. And so you have a lot of nuances you can pick up among that sort of very spread out palette. You know, it's not like there's, I mean, like in the whole world, there's like 3 different beech species, 3 or 4, where in Australia, you know, there's 1,000 eucalypts, you know, so
Wow.
species selection is quite, I think, is becoming, and I'm trying to sort of propel to be quite a serious thing. Don't think that every species of a genus is going to be the best representation of that genus, you know. So already, why I bring that up is in the past, there's been a lot of let's say historical use of Australian trees for bonsai in Australia for quite a long time. Bonsai has been practiced in Australia since the 20s, 30s, 40s, somewhere around there, a long time. There was a nursery called the Koroshoff Nursery, which was started by the Koroshoffs, and they, you know, started their nursery in the 50s, you know, it was a long time ago. And so they very early on sort of endorsed Australian trees as bonsai, and there was a little book that they wrote about it. And so you'll have like quite a few practitioners. A few that come to mind are Peter Hanrahan, Will Fletcher, and more recently you got Quentin Valentine, Marcella Ferreira, Jared Bailey, who's a really good friend of mine. All these people I know quite well. And, you know, what comes to mind is all those people primarily when I think about, you know, who has been or who currently is or who still really, really is propelling, you know, the use of Australian plants as bonsai and really keying into very distinct species. So all those people are great references. You know, I'd say Jared and myself are the most recent in that sort of repertoire of people, Marcella as well, in whom we are trying to like really sort of endorse the use of local plants for bonsai, which again, I think is kind of in my mind, is the point of bonsai, right? It's what the Japanese do. You don't see the Japanese using a whole bunch of Australian trees, right? They're using native local trees to their area. You know, Chinese bonsai, you'll see a very similar thing, or penjing. And in America, you see this. I feel like from a distance, America seems to be so native centric nowadays. At least that's my perception of it.
I think in the Mirai ecosystem for sure.
Yeah.
But I would say like the majority of bonsai practitioners, at least in California, for example, it's very focused on Japanese species because, you know, it was started and there's roots in it from Japanese people, right? That came over and started these nurseries in California, right? So at least in the Bay Area where I'm at, there's a lot of, I would say it's predominantly Japanese species. You do see some California juniper and Sierra juniper,
That's
but
already
it's a lot of black pine, shimpaku, and mainly those.
Yeah.
But yeah.
Yeah. And you'll see the same thing is true here. Like Australia still is, I think, as a whole, very much like there is the camp of those who believe good bonsai is using Japanese species. And I mean, that's a mighty fine artist statement if that is what you're interested in for sure. But what I see increasingly is this sense of like, oh yeah, bonsai is more than just replicating an art form with using the same materials, but decontextualize from why those materials were used in the first place. And I see now more I think like people hungry for wanting to reference and articulate their local environments, which again, I think is how bonsai kind of like has transcended from, you know, those original cultures who have practiced it and we still look to today. So, you know, I'll look at a Japanese artist doing the best trident maple work and I'll go, wow, that's really beautiful. How do I reach that pinnacle with a species that like we have a species here that's really come to rise lately, Nothofagus cunninghamii or myrtle beech. It's part of the southern hemisphere beech species. So that's why I brought up beech before because it's a good comparison. So there's 20-something Nothofagus, which are basically a very distantly broken off lineage of Fagus. So Fagus went north and Nothofagus went south. And so Nothofagus cunninghamii has a leaf that looks like a European beech. It's about a centimeter, you know, about sort of a third of an inch at biggest, vigorous like a Chinese elm, and has the aesthetics of a deciduous, most gorgeous plant in the world. And to me, that's becoming a very keystone species in Australia. at least in the climates you can grow it. It does have a limited range because it is a cool temperate plant. But, when I look at, say, like really good beech/maple bonsai, it kind of fits like this in-between world. It's an evergreen tree though. It's not deciduous, but you can still pick up that kind of feeling from it. When I look at like building branches, building trunks, if you were to grow something from the ground up, building ramification, like I'm looking at good deciduous trees for that reference point. But I'm going to throw in the nuances that the attributes of the foliage give you, the attributes of the growth habit give you, and references to ancient specimens in the landscape. You mix all that together and you end up with an aesthetic that will be as flawless as a beautiful best maple bonsai in Japan, but it will have the nuances naturally of Nothofagus in Australia, because I don't think you can make the best of a species without honoring the natural growth habit, because you're always pushing upstream, right?
Yep.
I think bonsai is quite intuitive in that regard. Like, I get asked that all the time. Like, what is the flavor of this species when you make it into a bonsai? And kind of the simplest answer is just allow the tree to grow how it would grow. Like, don't fight against the growth habit. If you honor the growth habit into refinement, you will end up with the best aesthetic for the tree, because it's formed that into itself.
The oldest aesthetic of the tree. Yeah, exactly. Or like the most age in the aesthetic, because it's the natural continuation of what it wants to do. Yeah, it makes sense. Man, hearing you talk about this has me so jazzed about, in the Bay Area, there's a lot of debates about like, graft or keep the current foliage.
I
And
follow that topic heavily. Yeah. I've loved hearing it come up in your podcast a lot, actually.
Yeah. Well, it's a very hot topic. And I mean, the argument for Japanese species is like, hey, you can get this, you get the, you build a tree with foliage that is going to behave in a predictable way, and with the techniques that we have is going to lead to a very, like exactly what you were talking about, like the bonsai techniques lead to this old as a bonsai design to the foliage, right? Like why try something hard when you can try the easy mode, right? But I think exactly what you're capturing is like the counterpoint of, and I think you said it in a really good way, of like, there's a feeling or a contextualization that you can get from, like, if you have a certain goal in mind where you want to capture the feeling of your native environment, then there's really no other way to do that than to use native foliages, right? And native plants.
Yeah. It's a funny topic with the juniper graft or not graft topic, because like from my perspective, it's a very Northern Hemisphere issue. We don't have that talk here because we don't have a native juniper to like be like, we can collect these amazing native junipers, but we have this Japanese foliage that we could graft onto them. Should we or shouldn't we? It just doesn't even come up here because we don't have a native juniper to graft onto in the first place. So it's not even like the discussion happens in that like, oh, you might have a, squamata and bracumbens are really common here, right, as a landscape tree, much like I think they are in every corner of the world, it seems. And so, there is the thought of like, should you graft some Kishu or Intoigawa onto that? Cool, you could. And it doesn't really matter because you don't have this dramatic connection to it being this representation of the wild because it came from the wild. It didn't. So the argument is in the spot, right? It's like, okay, well, if you like that, if it looks better, it's easier, cool, go for it, right? It's less connected. So I find it fascinating seeing that that argument, and I don't think there's a wrong or a right answer, right? At the end of the day, it's like, from my perspective, it's like, as you say, like if you really want the material to honor itself and showcase itself outside of like idolized aesthetics, which is kind of personal, I think, the idolized aesthetic, well then, use the native foliage and find technique or live with technique that allows the tree to be what it can be and represent itself wholly. I know that's very much the Mariah philosophy, is like, if you put a different bit of foliage on a Rocky Mountain juniper, it's not going to, the foliage doesn't have a correlation to the aesthetics that were built in the tree over time. There is a connection there. And I really resonate with that. I think that's really cool. If you put a different foliage on it, it just says a different thing now. It does speak to more of the ornamentalization of bonsai as an object, less so than a communication tool, potentially. And they're just different statements, you know, they're different worlds. It's like a live edge bit of wood versus a really milled piece of wood, you know, like which do you prefer? Same wood, different aesthetics, right? Different communication. But I mean, you could see it as well. Like, again, Rocky Mountain juniper foliage in a sense is like, it's like if you want to work with that foliage and have it imbue the aesthetics that it articulates, to me, it's no different than like working with a really large leaf species of plant. Like you have a tree that has this giant leaf that you can only reduce to a point, but you kind of accept the aesthetic of it because it's beautiful in its own right. So I sort of see that argument going in that direction. It's like, yeah, maybe the foliage isn't like this to perfect scale, but is it still beautiful, and does it still give you the feeling of the tree when styled well of a larger counterpart? I think that's kind of what matters, if that's what you want to matter, right? And to have the community be able to digest that intention would be really cool to see. Yeah, but interesting.
I'm just gonna let you cook because that was really well put. I really like
I
how
think it's
you
easier to talk
articulated that.
about it being away from it, you know, not being it a part of my like ecosystem of discussion. It's like, oh, okay.
Yeah. Well, I would say the analog would be like somebody in Australia might go, oh, like why would we use eucalyptus when I could use trident maple? You know, like the analog would be like why use an Australian species instead of a Japanese species, right?
Yeah. Well, I'll tell you what the difference is. This is where I think it becomes like a discussion, is because a native in the Northern Hemisphere, like a lot of the species, the genuses that are used in Japan, the genuses you're using a lot of them are the same genus, just different species. And so you have this very direct link, where in Australia, we don't have that. There's almost no genuses in the Southern Hemisphere that are shared with the Northern Hemisphere. And so that discussion of like, oh, like we have a Sabina juniper or a Rocky Mountain juniper or a Chinese juniper, that, you know, will we cross-pollinate all the foliages? That discussion doesn't come up because there is no native Australian juniper. There's a plant that looks exactly the same. It's called Dicelma, and it looks just like Shimpaku juniper. And it's very, very far distantly related conifer, but it's not juniperus, it's Dicelma. Looks the same, looks like a juniper foliage, but very underutilized and impossible to collect due to restrictions, et cetera, et cetera. So a different discussion in itself. But that to me, I think, is where that minutiae of that discussion comes in, is because the Northern Hemisphere shares all these species among similar genuses, where in the Southern Hemisphere we don't. You know, we refer to any tree that doesn't come from Australia. We have this terminology called exotics. So there's natives and there's exotics. It's a really interesting sort of a piece of language that I think is quite unique to Australia when you talk about plants. And it's curious because natives kind of
You're broadening my horizons here.
Yeah, and that's kind of the island mentality that we deal with. I didn't realize how unique it is to us when I've traveled outside of Australia. And I don't see that same kind of terminology used. And it's very deep in the bonsai world. It's almost like there's this, are you a native guy or an exotic guy, you know? And it becomes a little bit of a camp, you know, which I do kind of grind against, because as soon as you say like, are you a native person or I use natives, you instantly get put in this world of like, it's just a local plant. Plants from the rest of the world are really awesome, but local plants are kind of like different, you know? And it's a very, very curious sort of a mentality, and it exists in the horticultural world. Like you go to a regular retail nursery and you'll see on the billboard like what's latest in stock, and they'll have like camellias are in, hydrangeas are in, you know, firs are in stock, and then it will say and new natives, and it's like, well, what does that mean? You've identified these individual types of plants, but then when you speak about Australian plants, which some of the most biodiverse region on the planet for the amount of plants that are here, it gets put in one category as native. It doesn't get singled out.
That's crazy.
Oh, we've got some beautiful Nothofagus in today. It's like natives. And that mentality transcends across the bonsai world and the plant community in Australia in general, the gardening world in general. You know, there'll be all these specifics, but then it's natives. And that is, I think, disintegrating slowly as an adoption of, even in the gardening world, utilizing more local plants. I think there's starting to become, I see it a lot more communication around specifically talking about your individual region and the plants that come from there, and speaking about them as individuals, not as this one concept. Because just like North America, southeast of Australia is nothing like the northwest of Australia. Just because they're under the banner of one country doesn't mean anything, right? Necessarily.
Yeah, absolutely. So which species are you most excited about? I'd love to understand like, which ones are like the established species that you're like, okay, people have been doing these since the 20s. We have great examples. And you also think that that's a great species for bonsai in Australia. And then I'd also be interested in, are there any like, pocket species that you have where you're like,
Yeah.
hey, out of this 100 species of 100 species of this genus, like I chose narrowed down to these three that I'm going to try to see how they take to bonsai cultivation. And I think they're going to take well because of X, Y, Z.
Yeah.
Yeah. I'm curious what you think the up and comers are and what are the heavy hitters?
Yeah. Yeah. So classics, I think, in Australian bonsai to date are probably, at least in my area, number one is Port Jackson fig, we call it. Ficus rubiginosa is the botanical name. And it's kind of the hero of the Sydney region in terms of bonsai. It's been used for a long time. It's probably one of the first trees to really be extensively collected in Australia because they grow on anything. They'll grow on buildings, bridges, gutters. And when a lot of early development was happening in Australia throughout Sydney is like, it's made up of a lot of like sort of sandstone ridges and like sandstone valleys and all sorts of really textured sort of environment when you remove all the buildings. And so early in the days when people were first doing bonsai, there was a lot of collecting of ficus from, be building new houses and dynamiting off a bit of sandstone. And it would be covered in ficus, ancient ficus, probably hundreds of years old, stunted on the edge of cliffs and stuff. So a lot of the really beautiful, old, gnarly, kind of irregular looking ficus bonsai that, move around the Sydney sort of scene quite extensively. Some of them could be hundreds of years old. They're just these anomalies of blobs of wood that have some foliage coming out of them and have been bonsai for decades already. So they're probably it's probably one of the most interesting local native plants. And even in Australia, it gets forgotten. A lot of people forget that people talk about natives and then they forget that the ficus is actually native because it is so synonymous. It is so regularly used. Kind of gets put in the camp of trident maples in a sense, but it is a very native plant. So that's probably one of the most like long running, commonly used one, and great for beginners because you literally can't kill them. You could not water it for months and it wouldn't die. So you'd lose all your development, but it wouldn't die. So that's a good one. There's like some eucalypt species that have been used for a long time, minimal numbers, but Eucalyptus nicolai has been used, and there's some great examples out there. What else is there? Caledonensis, Eucalyptus caledonensis, the river red gum, another one that's been sort of championed and is seen to be used a lot. A lot of the good eucalypts have a naturally small leaf. In that juniper discussion, I'd say eucalypts are kind of like that one world where like if you could develop an awesome trunk of one species and better foliage with another, I would say grafting is kind of like, that's where our debate might come in. It hasn't really been done much to date, but I could see that becoming an argument in the future of like, do you keep the eucalypt foliage or do you graft a better one on, because the small leaves do make, eucalypts are almost like their own world of horticulture. They're quite interesting plants the way they function. They're very haphazard. And so the smaller the leaf is naturally, the less haphazard they seem to be in terms of losing branches or dying back or fluctuating too much. So that's an interesting nuance we could go into for hours. But what else have we got? I'm just trying to think. Like a lot of Melaleuca lanarifolia has been used for a long time. It's called the claret top Melaleuca. It's been used for a long time. Beautiful small leaves, really compact nature, very vigorous. Trying to think what else. Callistemon viminalis is another one that's been used. It's used throughout just the general nursery trade pretty extensively. And probably more recently, trees that have maybe in the last 10 years that have come into sort of the common use in a lot of people's gardens is Kunzia phyllochloides in Victoria, Kunzia ambigua in New South Wales have really become quite common, I think, throughout our regions. And then in Tasmania, which are the three places I know about the most, Tasmania, the Nothothegus cunninghamii or Myrtle Beach has been used for a long time, pretty extensively. It's only recently sort of like become less taboo. And for a long time, it was thought that it was an impossible species to make bonsai out of. And then you actually do it, and it's actually really easy. It was just all talk. They're like a maple. They require shade in summer and lots of water. If you don't do that, they die. If you do that, they grow like a weed. So just that nuance around horticulture. And then in WA, on the other side of the country, they have been very local plant centric for a long time. Western Australia has some of the most strictest biosecurity laws in the whole world. They from a biosecurity perspective, lock themselves off from the rest of Australia. So it's hard to get plants into Australia. But then if you want to take them to WA, there's another boundary again. So even plants from the East Coast don't get transported to the West Coast without massive restrictions and processes. So the bonsai community there, they haven't even had much access to black pine or shimpaka juniper or maples or any of the classics like we have on the East Coast. So they have, from a very early time, have used locally collected Melaleucas and Casuarina species, majorly being Melaleuca rafiophila and Melaleuca cuticularis are two phenomenal plants that have been used for a long time over there and are quite well known as sort of mainstays of that region. So they're a really interesting one in that regard. So yeah, they're probably all the classic.
Where do you recommend? Well, I was going to ask, where do you recommend folks go to see examples of these species as bonsai? I'm just pulling up your Instagram, which I'm assuming is a good place. But
yeah, I've got
are there
some
any
of them
recommendations you have for like how do people put I was going to say names to the faces. How do they put the tree to the name? And see what it looks like as a good bonsai.
Yeah, again, like all of those people I mentioned earlier, if you want to find good references online, like they're people who you'll be able to see good work from and catalogs of that work. Quentin Valentine less so. He goes by, I won't mention it in case it is meant to be like secretive. I'm not sure, but he goes by a different name on Facebook. But if you go onto the Victorian Native Bonsai Club page on Facebook, you'll see heaps of his work on there. There's a guy, I'll just say Grim Elder. I don't think it's secret. I don't think he just goes by a different name on Facebook for the sake of it. I'm not sure why. Everyone knows it's Quentin, at least in Australia. But if you, Marcella Ferreira, she's on Instagram and Facebook, and Will Fletcher, not so much, but you'll be able to find examples of his work online. Now, Will has a little bit more of an eccentric style. Let's say a hands-off style. He's always been very much about allow the plant to grow in the container with very minimal intrusion. It's very Dan Robertson in a way, his mentality around bonsai. So you'll see that kind of flavor, but in an Australian aesthetic through Will. And then, my colleague and friend Jared Bailey, he has some exams. Him and I work together quite closely. We both are on sort of the same journey. Our journeys are similar. We're similar ages. We've built businesses at a similar time in bonsai, and we work together literally in many, many facets. So we have very much a raise each other up rather than compete with each other mentality in what we do.
That's awesome.
Yeah, really beautiful.
Well, that's what makes it fun, right? Like having peers that you're pushing each
Absolutely.
other and can grow together. Like bonsai isn't so cutthroat that, at some point it's got to be like, you want to be a part of this community and you want to build it, right? And like, that's the fun part, is being with these other people that like, it would be fun. It wouldn't be fun if you were just there alone doing it, right? Even if you made more money or whatever, it just wouldn't be the same.
No, exactly. And I think that's extremely important in Australia, that we keep our community tight and close and friendly and helping each other, because Australia is a big country. It's only a smidgen smaller in landmass than North America. I mean, not North America, but the United States of America. It's only a tiny bit smaller, and yet we have the population of LA. It's 27 million people. I think that's roughly similar to the SoCal, basically. We've got to stay close, us Australians, and that's really important. And that's something that I think is valuable, that we do work together and we do support each other and give each other pats on the back and say good job, and congratulate each other on their achievements, because we are a small community that is spread out. We're all quite spread out, Yeah. Imagine getting LA and just going.
How does that work for shows?
Yeah. Look,
how does that work for bonsai shows? Because like in the US, we basically have to split into regional shows, right? Like West, Central, East. But like, what does it look like in Australia? Like, how do you do exhibitions?
Well, to date, a lot of Australian shows have been really just confined to individual club shows. There hasn't been many, if any, like nationally recognized shows, except for it's called the AABC convention, which is a traveling convention. AABC is like a central body in Australia, and they support local artists, demonstrators, professionals, and give subsidies to clubs to be able to bring people to each club. And part of that, they do conventions, which helps them to raise money to add that, to offer that subsidy to clubs. So the convention has been almost like a traveling event that goes, it gets sort of bidded on to be at different clubs around the country. And so every year it's in a different spot, and that club will then, it's a nationally recognized event. You know, they'll invite as many people who will come from all over the country, get in artists from overseas or locally, or lately both, which has been really cool to see, and exhibit trees from that region, you know. So that's kind of been the greatest example of some nationally recognized event. And lately there's a show that's been running for a couple of years now, which is a club show in its own right. It's called the Bonsai Open, which is a show that I originally, when it started, I sort of helped sort of bring to light through the old president, Steve Reeve. And he was really passionate about having a nationally recognized show that invites people to exhibit in the show from anywhere in the country. And so I was quite passionate about it at the time and sort of helped out a little bit. And then I sort of walked away from helping out because I moved to a different area. But I'm very much a part of that show every year, exhibiting, vending, demonstrating, helping out where I can. It is, in a sense, without defining it as such, it wouldn't define itself, but it is our greatest example currently of a nationally recognized show where technically anyone in the country can exhibit, and there's prize money, and there's, you know, it's judged, and there's vendors from an increasing amount of places in the country. They've just expanded their vendors area for next year, which is cool to see. It's a slowly building event, but that tends to be the theme in Australia because there's a lot of space, very little people. Any progress, it happens, but it happens at a lot more of a casual rate. It seemingly than what I see in other parts of the world. And that's okay. That's just how it is. And I'm sure there'll be more shows that come up in the future because I think there is a hunger that's starting to develop for a little bit more recognition of each other's work and having that sort of place to be able to like almost like drive your practice forward. I mean, I've seen that even on the West Coast with the PBE, you know, I went to the first one and it was instantly recognizable that this is like progressing the community. From that first minute the doors opened to that show, I was like, oh, God, this is so needed in Australia too. Because it creates this really beautiful reference point to be able to progress the community skills.
Exactly. It's a compelling event, right?
It is, yeah. Very important. And so I see that's whether it's the Bonsai Open or another show or both or many will start to create that kind of atmosphere increasingly so. But I think it will be, if it does increase over time, I think it will be like what I see in the States where there's almost a show for different regions because again, it is a big country. And literally in WA, you can't bring trees to the East Coast. Well, sorry, I'll correct you.
Exactly.
You could, but they just can't go home. And so...
Really?
Yeah, so you can bring trees from WA to the East Coast. Tasmania is the same. They have restrictions. You can't take things there, but you can bring things back to the mainland. You can take things there. You just got to get permits and get inspections, and there is a list of species that's quite large that you can't bring in. So there's just restrictions around. It's not impossible, but there's just restrictions.
Yeah. So you'd at least have to have two different regional shows to encompass
2 or
the country.
3. I could see 2.
Makes sense.
Yeah. But yeah, we'll see.
That's really cool. I mean, it's really exciting to hear and think about the analogs to American bonsai that you have in your Australian community. I think there's a lot of similarities, and I think we can. I thought you're pulling out kind of that, or teasing out that point that like, hey, the debate around natives is different in Australia because it's a different ecosystem, right? Southern versus northern hemisphere. Like that was kind of mind bending to me. I'd never thought of that before. So that was really fascinating. So yeah, I guess while we're talking about shows and social media, one thing that I wanted to have a chat with you about was, there's this pressure to create this very like aesthetically pleasing, clean 2D work for Instagram and online, platforms, right? So, you know, I think this is a fairly new part of the bonsai creation process, right? Before there was widespread cameras, like yes, the tree had to look perfect in the Kokufu exhibit for the picture in the magazine or the drawing. I wonder like was creating these really like very clean, perfectly 2D pictures from like the first styling all the way to the last styling, like was that prevalent in Japanese bonsai creation? I mean, I don't know if either of us can answer that question, but
Yeah.
I wanted to get your thoughts on like during your styling process, what do you think of or how do you think of the like picture perfect aesthetic?
Yeah, when you brought up that you wanted to talk about this topic, it really got me thinking because it is an interesting thought as to like do you think about this question in regards to like because I think what you're trying to sort of like speak to is it about the image or is it about the development, and are those two things separate or intertwined in a way? And I think
Exactly. Yeah. Thank you for expanding on that. Yeah.
yeah, and I think it's the same discussion around like the demo. Is the demo a bad or a good thing? And I guess I'm going to be, again, as I think I have been in a lot of these discussions, sort of on the fence in the middle and looking at both sides, because I don't see it as sides, right? I think there's a more complicated discussion to be had here. But, the example you actually sent me when you sort of brought up this topic, you sent me a picture of a shore pine that I'd styled in New Zealand. And I instantly had a reference to what you're talking about, because that image, yes, everything does look very well placed and almost like the styling process made the tree in a way look like it hadn't been styled in a certain sense. It just sort of became that thing if you remove the wire that you can see in the image. I think like it's material dependent. And I say material rather than species because that's the way I like to think about bonsai concepts, is like what materials are you using? And in the case of a shore pine, which was collected and has had a lot of pruning done over, gosh, I think that tree a decade or two from collection, in order to produce the branches that would one day be styled with wire, there was so much preparation work that had gone into that tree's development to lead it up to the wiring process, that the wiring process was just organizing what was already built and putting more scale into the branches, to create that. Yes, it was a plant in a pot to now it's this nature in miniature imagery, right? So the stage of development for that tree required me to be very exacting in the way I placed the branches, because the branches were of the development state that they can be refined on top of from that moment forward. So that is what influenced that process. Now, if that tree were developmental and I was using wire to place the structure in the secondary branches, and there were goals of compacting areas or elongating areas or backbutting certain spots, my styling wouldn't be as quote unquote beautiful looking in an image. It would look more functional because that is what is required of the scope of work. The candles would be
Well,
placed.
you brought up an interesting
Yeah, you go. Sorry, man.
you brought up an interesting point of there's a stage in which the work that you do should build upon itself, and thus like the structure that you set is very important. But to me, like, shouldn't every stage of work on a tree include that? Like,
Mm.
if we're kind of maximizing efficiency, like I should be like in that very first styling or whatever, right? I should always be, getting rid of things that won't ultimately be in the design and keeping things that should be, right? So to me, it's like, well, if that's your argument that like it's appropriate for certain stages where you need to be very precise with the placement, couldn't that be every stage?
Yeah, I think it's both. I think you're right, but also I think it's like degrees of exactness, right? So if I go back to that example of that tree, if that tree were just say the primary and secondary structure, and that secondary branches were long, needle covered recent, previous years pieces of growth, as I lay those branches down and construct the secondary line, this is real nerdy stuff. We're getting into the nerdy bonsai stuff here, right? If I was laying out that secondary
I
line,
love it.
it would be needle clad, right? Because for me to strip off all the needles just to the tip would be to impede the development of backbuds, which gives me the density that you do see in that particular image, right? Which has been achieved just by slow pruning over a number of years instead. But if I were to encounter that tree, I may take the route of, oh, let's actually get down and do the structural wiring now and work on building backbuds. So I can do a similar, more clean, almost refined looking styling on the tree later. So if I'd done that work before, I'd be laying out secondary branches that are all covered in needles like a big foxtail. And by default, the styling would look messier because there's only so much cleaning I can do before I impede the development of the product I'm trying to achieve in the first place. So I guess that's more what I mean is like looking at the material and what actually is physically on the material does dictate how clean maybe it looks in an image, but that doesn't displace the cleanliness of the line, right? The lines would still, let's say I was building that tree to be exactly like that tree in the future image. The lines would be still the same level of cleanliness, but the foliage maybe not so, because the foliage just is in that stage.
Got it.
So I think like, I do prescribe to the Mirai mentality of like every time you work a tree, make the best tree you can, but it is still, and the most beautiful aesthetic you can, but it is still co-aligned and like it is dependent on the stage of development.
It doesn't sacrifice the development.
No,
Right.
exactly. And look, okay. I will admit, like a lot of like I don't put most of my work on social media, and there's a lot of times where I do a scope of work and it's just routine, it's rudimentary, it's getting, for lack of a better term, getting shit done. And in my curatorial process, I'm working on trees all day long, every day. And I've been lately in the last year since I'm buying a property and developing that property and starting to do work there and transitioning, I've been very low activity on social media just due to a lack of time. For a while there, I was pretty on it. But it doesn't mean any less tree work has happened. In fact, more. And so I do happen to, when I do whack something on social media, it's because I'm like, hell yeah, this is looking nice, like, and that's the reality of it. It does make me think that like, and have been trying to do this a bit more lately, is be a bit more off the cuff with it, like, hey, here's just what I'm doing. And it may look beautiful, it may not. It may look productive. It may look like sometimes, like lately I've been doing a bit of repotting that is slightly outside of ideal timing, but I've just been a bit behind in certain actions, and I feel like I have the skill set to be able to nurture the tree through that slightly unideal timing of repotting. So I'm doing it. And I will be honest, I have a certain hesitation around putting that on social media because I don't want to give people the wrong idea. But also, I probably should, because I should show people the reality of what's happening, right? And it doesn't look beautiful. It might look messy. It might be out of time with what I would recommend. But maybe that is the role of social media, to be a bit more like, hey, like you're seeing actually what is happening in the world. And that means some less beautiful, highly curated imagery going up online, And so that is something I want to challenge myself to do a lot more. But I guess like one of my sort of goals in bonsai and one of my design philosophies is I appreciate line in trees very heavily. Although I do enjoy a really good full design, like a tree that's a lot more, let's say, masculine or impactful in terms of mass. I make trees like that all the time. I do enjoy trees like that. But if I had to say, what's my like personal body of work, what do I enjoy the most? It's trees that embody a lot more, exposure of the line. And that doesn't just mean, it means the trunk, it means the branching, it means the secondary branching, it means the dead wood, it means even the container, right? A lot more sort of lines. And I think when you work in line-based design, much like gets spoken about with bunjin or literati type forms, when you have more negative space than mass, your attention to every line matters so much more than when you can cover up that line in deep foliage and there's a lot more mass. And so because of that aesthetic ideal that I try and seek, it does mean that inherently I have to be so much more savvy around line placement. And that does then translate into trees that are a lot heavier feeling. I still could be very exact about my line placement in those designs. And so that just creates a different aesthetic feel in general. But I do think that also
Yeah.
is, if we speak
But that
about,
precision translates well to 2D.
for sure, and it's not because I can see the question in this being like, do I make trees look good for photos? And I'd say no, but it is the fact that if it looks good in a photo, I think I've done my job, right? But I'm not trying to make the tree look good for a photo. I know Sergio Kwan, I think it is. He does a lot of deciduous work, and I swear I've heard him speak about when he's finishing a wiring process or a pruning process on a tree in leaf drop. He'll sit the tree in front of a very clean background and just precise everything out. I don't know if I'm making that up, but I feel like I've heard him say that. But at least his work does showcase that kind of mentality for sure. He's a very clean, precise line sort of styling. And I'd say I do a very similar thing to that. When I finish a tree which requires subtle precision, I will put it in front of a photo screen and I will set a camera back up at the ideal placement to how you would appreciate the tree in a show. And I'll look at the lens because the lens is very different. It two-dimensionalizes things and it picks out things that you don't see in 3D because you're moving, your eyes are looking at details. It is actually a different experience. And I do believe if a tree looks good in a photo, it looks good in real life. If the camera and everything is set up appropriately, that's the caveat though. You know, if you just take a picture from anywhere, it doesn't apply. Yeah, that's a big, big deal. I think.
And as long as you haven't taken these like made decisions that make the tree look good from the front, but the structure is poor from the
Exactly.
sides, right? Like you left everything on the back bare, but you pushed everything
Yeah,
forward, right?
yeah,
But like assuming you've
100%.
that makes sense. So summarizing my kind of like takeaway so far is the bonsai creation process lends itself to like product that you go through naturally, potentially, especially in like the later stages of refinement. The 2D image looks good because that's not because you're trying to make the 2D image look good, but because that's an important step in the bonsai creation process for the finished look that you want to achieve.
Sure.
And so there are potentially stages of bonsai development that like putting that extra work in to make the tree look good from a photo perspective can also benefit the like development process of the tree. And now like where do you draw that line of like which stages it's a vanity and which stages it's like important to the process? I think that is kind of tough, but very, very interesting to talk about.
Yeah, it is. But I think you summarized that well in that it's not that the image, you're not pursuing an image, it's the image is representing clear work. And that's really the caveat. And why I said before how this is similar to the demo idea, where there's this notion of, is this demo bad or good, right? Should you do a demo amount of work in a demonstration, right? I think it's the same thing. Like if you're doing a demonstration on a scope of work that takes the amount of time that the demonstration allots, then technically you're just working in reality, just with an audience, right? I think if you do create a piece of work that is like outside of realism, well, you're not doing a good demonstration at the end of the day. Like, I just think that's not good work, full stop. And I would discredit that idea, So when you are demonstrating, it is exactly in the word. It is demonstrating. You're demonstrating the bonsai process. So, it's why I appreciate events that allow demonstrations to occur for a day or multiple days like they do at the trophy. You're just seeing bonsai done in real time. So, if you have a 30-minute demonstration you're doing at a club, showcase a scope of work that requires 30 minutes or honor that you're only going to showcase part of it. And so in that sense, then the whole notion of is a demo bad or good becomes disqualified because you're just demonstrating bonsai work, right? But you're not trying to create any one outcome, outside of the means that is allotted to you. So the photo is the same, the photo looks precise because the work is precise, or the photo looks enjoyable to look at because the tree has been enjoyable to look at. If it looks messy, but the lines are built well, it's just the stage of work that's being showcased.
Yeah, I like that. That makes a lot of sense. I 100% agree with you on the demo front too. It's like the worst thing you can do is say something like, oh, I just made these decisions because it's a demo.
Yeah.
You're almost, it's like, okay, you're like, oh, if yeah, exactly. Then you just butchered a tree, right?
Yeah, exactly.
That like if you're saying like, oh, I don't have the time to complete the necessary scope of work, like reduce the scope, right? So say like, oh, I'm not going to be able to finish secondary refinement work, like I'm just going to be able to set the primary structure in this time frame, right? But set it correctly. Set the structure that you'd want to set for your own tree.
For sure.
Yeah, it makes sense. Cool. Well, this has been a blast, Hugh. I really appreciate you taking the time to chat with me. This has brought up a bunch of questions for me about Australia and the bonsai community there. So I hope we get some more chances to talk in the future too.
Absolutely.
But is there anything you want to leave folks with? And like, how can they connect with you? Like, where should they be watching what Hugh's doing?
Yeah. Look, I guess what I want to leave people with from this chat is just like, I mean, we've talked about some really interesting things, and I do want to say I really admire this podcast. The reason I reached out to you was to say, like, it wasn't to be on the podcast. It was to say, like, hey, like, I'm actually finding it a really valuable resource for myself as a teacher. Hearing someone have a podcast dedicated to the process of becoming the best practitioner you can, and what does that look like, and the journey you take, and basically, what's the phrase you use? Optimizing your bonsai practice. It's actually just been a really good tool for me. I'm both like, yes, I do bonsai professionally. It is also my creative outlet. It is also my hobby. It's I'm still a hobbyist as much as I am a professional, you know what I mean? So it's kind of when you do your passion as a job, that is the confusing world you sit in, right? At all times. You sit down in the studio and you go, am I working or am I having fun? Or am I doing both? What are you doing? So it's been very insightful for me to see questions asked of yourself that allows me to think like, oh, okay, that's a really good question to try and answer from a teacher's perspective, or to optimize my ability to overlay information to students or clients better, So yeah, I've found your podcast one of the best resources I've come across in a long time for actually excelling my practice, which is cool, both professionally and personally. So I kind of want to leave folks with that. If you're listening, you're obviously listening. So keep listening. And yeah, I'd love to do this more. I'd love to sort of, have a once in a while little check-in, give you a bit of a update on what's happening in Australia to your audience. That would be really exciting because I think Australia has a lot to offer. I understand we're hard to get to, but even if you can appreciate from afar, I think Australia from a bonsai perspective will begin to, if not already has started to offer a lot more like another layer of focus that I think even the Northern Hemisphere can start to digest and add to the repertoire of practice, much like we do here. We digest Northern Hemisphere information readily, and that's how we've gotten better at our Northern Hemisphere species. So I feel like that is Australia's big role in the bonsai sort of scheme of things globally, will be to maybe offer a lot more breadth, not more, but like another breadth of aesthetic nuance, aesthetic consideration, but also physiologically more horticulture and species nuance from the broadleaf evergreen realm. I think that's a really big place that we'll sort of be able to offer to the community if they're willing to listen and look. So I'm sort of putting my hand up there and saying like, hey, check us out and see what we're doing. Not just me, but everyone in Australia. So that's sort of my final words on that. Yeah, if people want to find my work, my company is called Tree Makers. So, I chose to remove bonsai from the word of my business name very intentionally because I wanted to sort of focus more on like the process, building bonsai. I really like that about the slogan of your podcast because it resonates with what my business name is trying to reference, is like, we're just making trees here. We're building trees in whatever spirit or aesthetic or place that looks like. Right. So, so we focus on, teaching, a lot of the time, client services, and, we sell trees, but we sell trees primarily to, our students and customers that we affiliate closely with, or at shows and events. So we're very much like Tree Makers is becoming, and is designed to be, and is becoming more so in a way like a bonsai gym. I like to think about it, a place to learn, develop your skills. And
a dojo.
The dojo. Yeah. And tap into something I'm looking at doing, and sort of, I guess, like let's say, voicing or making a part of our brand image over the next sort of 12 months is really focusing on the broadleaf evergreen realm of Australian bonsai. And so we're looking to sort of focus a lot more, not that we don't already, but focusing a lot more on broadleaf evergreen as a major educational focus through our school. And there'll be lots of classes and programs affiliated with that coming up. So, so check us out on the website, treemakers.com.au. Don't forget the .au. And Instagram at treemakers and Facebook at treemakers as well. And I will mention as well, me and my best mate and colleague, Jared Bailey from Montaigne Bonsai, we have a joint venture called A Bonsai Side Quest, which is a podcast. So you can find that on my website, links to it on my website or Jared's website, montaignebonsai.com. Or on Spotify, Podbean, and Apple Podcasts. So please check that out. Appreciate it.
Yeah, I will admit I did not actually know that you had a podcast before you came on today, but I'm definitely going to be checking it out after today.
Oh,
so
awesome.
if you're half as eloquent as you were on the episode today, then I think there's going to be a lot of great stuff on there.
We have a lot of fun on it. It's kind of the podcast, the whole design of it was to sort of give a fly on the wall to sort of Jared and I's discussions that we have regularly, which is, so it's non-serious. We have some topics every now and again, but a lot of the time it's just us catching up, having a coffee if it's the morning, having a beer if it's the evening, and just talking about our thoughts and feelings around what's going on in our bonsai circles, at the time. So yeah, pretty off the cuff, but it's very enjoyable.
Yeah, I think you've got a really dangerous combination from our conversation today in terms of dangerous in a good way, a unique but powerful combination of a very free spirit, but still a really analytical and a mind that wants to uncover and always learn. And so, I'm really excited to see what you do within the context of the Australian bonsai community and then how that impacts the rest of the world. So yeah, really, really looking forward to seeing more of these Australian species that I learned about today, and what they can become, and see how that influences the global zeitgeist of bonsai aesthetic and design.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Addison. Yeah, and keep up the podcast, and thank you for having me on. Really appreciate it. It's been heaps of fun. I've really enjoyed it.
Yeah, for sure. Awesome. Well, thank you so much, everyone, for listening, and thank you, Hugh, for coming on. And yeah, if anybody has any thoughts, I'd love to hear people's thoughts on the photo progression debate. So feel free to message me on Instagram at Teeny Trees, and I'll make sure to pass any thoughts on to Hugh as well. Thanks, everyone, and have a good night or good day.
Thanks. Appreciate it.